Hello again, everyone. I'm Tom Nagorski. Welcome to the latest in our Cipher Brief series of conversations with our expert network, joined today by Ralph Goff, former senior intelligence executive at the CIA and a six-time CIA station chief in many parts of the world. And we're talking in broad terms, but I think we'll drill down into some specifics as we start a new year, as we start a new administration in the U.S., challenges facing the intelligence community, the IC, which, of course, for all the reasons that would be apparent from his bio and background, Ralph Goff is ideally suited to get at. And Ralph, when we use that phrase, challenges for the IC, does your mind run to crazy things going on in the world, or does it run to institutional issues? Both? Neither? What's your gut response?
That's a great question, Tom. And first of all, thanks for having me on today. And really good to see you. It's been a while, so it's good to be back. Big fan of the Cipher Brief. Great question. And you got it right in that my mind goes to both, right? Yeah. The intelligence community. And this, but this is nothing new, Tom. I mean, every 4 years, sometimes 8 years, the agency goes through having to adjust to a new administration. Right. And no two administrations are alike, even if it's the same president. Right. So, I can remember when I was still in active duty and we had a presidential transition, for someone like me, it wasn't an issue, right? Every 4 to 8 years, get a new president. In fact, Inauguration Day tends to occur the same day as my birthday, so I get a double celebration on the 20th of January. But I can remember about in the first Trump election, about 25% of the agency had never experienced a presidential transition, right? They were new employees, which meant that they hadn't been in the agency for more than 4 years. So a lot of people were, frankly, they're a little freaked out. What does this mean, a new president? So I can remember I was walking around, and I was talking to people, and I just said, hey, listen, let me ask you a question. Are you the director? Well, no. Who's appointed by the president? Are you the deputy director appointed by the director? No, I'm not. Well, are you the executive director or the chief operating officer appointment? No, I'm not. Last question. Are you the general counsel who's appointed by the director? I said, no. I said, well, then go back to work because none of this is going to change anything for you.
Right.
And this is one of the things I loved about the agency was, and I'm sure many of our critics out there will disagree with me, but frankly, the agency is one of the least politicized organizations in the federal government. Right? Mm-hmm. And presidents, whether they're pro-CIA or anti-CIA, after they get in office and they've worked with us for a while, they come to understand that as well, right? Because really there's only one presidential appointee, right? It goes through the confirmation process, the director. You compare that to State Department where you have, dozens and dozens of appointees from the Secretary of State to the undersecretaries, the deputy assistant secretaries, right? Senior policymakers, or DOD, which has hundreds, if not thousands, of political appointees, right? The agency, really, we have one, right? Mm. Now, we do have some directors who are more political than others, but that's not the agency. That's the director, right? Mm-hmm. So usually when I explain that to people, they calm down. And history has shown that, with the exception of maybe Stansfield Turner appointed back in the Carter days who came in and, cleaned out the place, right? Very little change happens, and the angst and the anxiety felt by the workforce is quickly eclipsed by the need to bring a new director and his or her team up to speed. Right, so that's where my mind goes first.
But so that's great context on kind of what might be happening inside the community right now, mm-hmm. in this transition phase.
Yes.
But put your your institutional knowledge hat mm-hmm. on in a different way.
Yeah.
And it doesn't need to pertain, or it can, to the Trump administration or not. Mm-hmm. What do you think are the core challenges facing the intelligence community writ large?
Yeah. Well, thank you for that question, because I did want to put that context out there just for the broader scope, right? Naturally, it's more complicated than that. And there are systemic challenges. For instance, now we have, we've had John Radcliffe, the director designate, who's testified already and was actually did a pretty good job, and it looks like he'll be easily cleared and appointed, right? But the new chairman of the Senate committee, right, Tom Cotton, they've both come out with announcements saying that there are serious problems at the agency, well, within the IC writ large and in the agency in particular, right? And both of them are stressing, this idea that the agency has kind of lost its way, right? That the focus on mission has been blurred or supplanted by a focus on what would normally be mission enablers, such as diversity, equity, and that agenda. Right?
Mm-hmm.
And I have to say, based on my experience, they're not really incorrect in that assumption. Right?
Mm-hmm.
There are changes that need to be brought to the IC and the agency in particular to focus on mission. And these are challenges, but the thing about the agency is, the incoming administration, who are very suspicious of the deep state, very suspicious of the federal workforce, right? They're going to find out that the IC in general and the agency in particular is one of the more compliant workforces they'll deal with, right? People in the agency mostly join for mission.
Right.
And if you get a director who comes in and says, mission is our number one priority, right? If they say it and then they actually follow that, follow that up with deeds and action, right? You'll get a very compliant workforce because the majority of the people there, they just want to do mission. They didn't sign up, they didn't join the agency for money, to get wealthy, right? They joined for the most part, and I base this on the people I've talked to over the years, and this doesn't differ with the generations. They join because they want to be a part of something bigger than themselves, right? And the agency offers that. And so what they need is a director who will come in and say, that's what we're about. Right. So I think the incoming administration, for all the angst and anxiety that we hear about in the intelligence community with their talks of shakeups and getting rid of people, right, and rumors that they're looking to, put in all these political appointees, I think that the IC is a different kettle of fish, right? And it's a workforce that, when properly led, is extremely compliant.
So just one, not a pushback, but just a follow-up, I guess.
Yeah,
a word has been kicked around. I think the president-elect used it, and some others have as well. It's not just that they're suspicious. The word is overhaul, that there needs to be an overhaul of the IC. And by the way, it isn't only, at the great sessions we had down at our threat conference last year with the Cipher Brief, there was a lot of talk about reform. I'm not sure how specific it got. The notion that there's so many tentacles now under the ODNI, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. Do you have any thoughts on any of that? I mean, overhaul is a big word, right?
It is. It's a big word, and it's a scary word, right? And usually, as opposed to overhaul, most directors or incoming administrators talk about change, right? So in this case, I think overhaul is probably a more correct interpretation of what they intend to do. But at the same time, right, world events, which you mentioned earlier, those things don't go away, and they certainly don't wait, right? None of our adversaries are going to go like, hey, wait, time out while the agency overhauls, right? While the USIC gets its act back together, right? So, any overhaul or any changes have to be made with the realization that, you can't put the machine on idle, and you can't create an environment where the mission becomes the overhaul itself, right? So there are limits to what you can do in a given amount of time, right? So with the incoming administration, we'll see how, we'll see how ambitious they are, and we'll see, how deep they want to make the changes based upon what they intend to accomplish. Remember, the president on day one, President-elect Trump says, he's got a full agenda. I mean, this administration, has already hit the ground running. You look at the peace process ongoing in Gaza, and the Biden administration generously included and wisely included a member of the Trump administration. Their Middle East negotiator was there, right? So and President-elect Trump was able to claim a share of the victory.
And it's sort of happening vis-a-vis Ukraine as well, right?
Yes, applies to the Ukraine as well.
Is there a not to put you on the spot, and but if you're in the room discussing a potential, are there things that you think are worthy of an overhaul?
Yes, absolutely. Look, one need only look at the track record for the last few years of the IC and the CIA, right? The collapse of Syria, right? The collapse of Afghanistan, right? the poor performance of the Russian military, the great heroic performance of the Ukrainian military, right? Um, the ongoing gray zone activities of Russian intelligence in Europe, right? Where were the predictions on this? Where were when was the policymaker alerted to this before the fact, right?
Right. Right.
So, one thing I've heard from people in the transition is, and all hyperbole aside, something that I've heard that makes sense is we want analysts to go back to being analysts, and we want operations people to go back to driving operations, right? And you go back to the reforms that were instituted with John Brennan under modernization. A lot of his modernization was long overdue and necessary. But, like any good deed, there are some times when things go past the limits. And in this case, the idea that, we're all intelligence officers first. Yes, that's great. But, there are huge differences. For instance, I'm an operations officer, right? I can spell PDB, right? President's Daily Brief, but you don't want me writing one, right? But I can go out and I can run the operations to collect the intelligence that will be used in that PDB, which I turn over to my analytical comrades, the best in the business, and they work on that. And so the new administration, and with all the, if you strip away all the criticism of wokeness and criticism of, deep state conspiracy and all, right, you get down to where they want to return balance to where people are doing the jobs that they were hired, vetted, trained, and expected to do.
Okay, very well put. Last point, then let's come back to some of that. Not to go through all the global events that are roiling us at the moment, but you said at the top, Ralph, that, in a way, nothing is new. And I'm reminded, that on I imagine on the briefings, for example, are some old chestnuts, if you will, of North Korea and the Middle East, of course, although that has changed, terrorism. But you do have, don't you, issues that weren't, even just take 8 years ago, Trump 1.0. I don't know how much he was hearing about hybrid warfare, about artificial intelligence threats and so forth. To some extent, just the threats themselves have changed, have they not?
Yes. Yeah, the threats have changed, right? Like anything, they've evolved, and along with them, technology has advanced, right? Big data, what we call ubiquitous technological surveillance, right? The ability of other countries to keep track of our activities and our movements, right? To the point where, in the past, it was the global superpowers who had the capabilities to run extremely effective, sophisticated intelligence operations or technical collection operations or counterintelligence operations, right? Now, the spread of technology and big data exploitation means any country can do it. Right?
Yeah.
So the threat now is more acute, and the adversaries are, I think, more equal, right? And so the challenge for the IC here is to, while we go through this overhaul, the challenge of the IC is to not lose more time as we try to catch up. Because remember, personally, I've said this numerous times, a lot of people think the greatest intelligence failure was 9/11. Well, that was a bad one, but an even greater failure was, in my opinion, the failure of the IC to adjust timely from the war on terror, right, to the global competition, right? Al-Qaeda was never an existential threat to the United States. Right? We figured them out, by 2005, we had them figured out, and we were, putting paid to them. But, it still took us another decade, 15 years or so to pivot, if you will, from counterterrorism back to where China was, target number one, and Russia, who never took their eye off us, right? These countries got a 20-year head start. And so the IC, the biggest challenge I see is for us to recover this lost ground, right? And we're only going to do that if we're not distracted by overhauls, right? And we're not distracted by political infighting, and we're not distracted by, political events in other countries that we have no control over. What we need to do is we need to focus on our own capabilities. We need to increase the partnership with the private sector. We've never needed the private sector more than we need it right now, right? And this new incoming administration, I've heard a lot of talk where they recognize that, the connections between Silicon Valley and Wall Street with the incoming administration. right, if properly managed, will help us gain ground.
Really appreciate it, Ralph. Ralph Goff, former CIA 6-time station chief, and just your observations and thoughts are really valuable for us and for our audience. Appreciate the
Thank you,
time.
Tom. Thank you. Good seeing you.